I'm going to start my slide presentation. You guys see my, I have to share my screen, don't I? Probably helps. All right, you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm talking today about is CSS transformations. And I'm just going, basically what a transform is, it alters certain properties of a project, such as rotating it, scaling it, skewing it, translations, moving it. Usually, and that's just usually altering the properties of an object, whether you want to spin it around, make it go crazy. No, this is just in the CSS part of it. It's not JavaScript like Carlos is going to go into. But so in CSS form, you're going to put transform, colon, usually the style, such as rotate, scale, skew, and then your parameter of how much you want it to actually do it. The another key point, which I'm not going to go into today, but you can use it in certain ones, is called the transform at origin. Basically, it changes the origin point of where it'll do things. Like if you right now, usually the default is the origin is right in the center of the object, but you can change it so it can rotate around different points, and it just looks for certain things like I said, rotations. There's a big one that needs a center point to rotate around. So if you make it rotate around a different part, it could change where it'll rotate. So I'll go into a little more about the basic 5 or the basic 4. Yeah, like I said, you have translations, which is moving objects, scaling, which is sizing objects, rotating, which is turning objects, and skewing, which is kind of stretching objects. So the first one is translations. It's moving the objects on the X and the Y axis. The 2 ways you can do it is translate, where you put an X value and a Y value, which it'll translate both of them. You can put negative values in there as well, so it can go the opposite direction. By default, the X value will make it push to the right, the Y value make it push down, as long as it's positive. Alternatively, you can do it individually, X and Y. You can translate X, I was supposed to say translate Y, but translate individually rather than. So examples of that, it shows, yeah, this one's translation, where if you put just one value, like right here, I have this to translate. If you only put one value in there, default it'll push the X value. So if you push it, translate this much, it jumps that much over. If you put 2 values in, it'll go down and over. The first value is over, so it'll be 100 over and then 40 down. So that shows that. Let's leave it like this then. Next thing you're going to talk about is scaling. That changes the size of the object. Once again, just like the other ones, you're going to have scale and scale X and scale Y. It's a very common pattern set up in transforming, because you can either, right here, if you put in the X value, it'll stretch it horizontally, and the Y value stretch it vertically. So whether you want it uniform to stretch it both ways, if you want one to go really tall and one to be really skinny, you can do it however you like. But that's going to look similar to, it's going to look like this. So now I have it as scaling. This doubles it. That halves it by doing scale 0.5, 0.5. And scale 2, 2. Doubles the X, doubles the Y. Halves the X, halves the Y. But next thing you're going to have is rotation, which is simple as it sounds. You rotate around the origin. As long as the default, the origin is going to be in the center of the object, which, so you'll see right about here is the center. So it'll rotate 90, 180, 270. And then there you're going to put an actual degree angle. So for example here, these ones have 90, it's the DEG for degree, 180 degree, 270 degree, and obviously 360 degree, we'll put it right back at the start. But that shows the 4 states. It can also have a ton of ones in between as well. Now last one, it's called skewing it. This one's a little funkier, so I actually had the properties of here. So the demo as it shows, based on how you skew it, this is the default. As this is the X angle and the Y angle you're going to be skewing. So when you skew it like this, it slowly starts to stretch itself. And as you get to 90, it's actually a straight line up and down. And then you go in the other way, skews its way back to, once it's at 180, it's back to normal, because you've skewed it back to starting point. some of the other ones they have, I was trying to do this with Java. I wanted to do it, but you had to do it with JavaScript. Like you saw, it was actually the rotating that you could actually. I was going to click it and have it rotate every time I wanted to do it. But now, lastly, the last thing I was going to talk about is if you want to do multiple transformations in the same type in CSS, like if you want to do the multiple translations to a div, multiple transformations. Like for example, let's say you want to rotate it and move it. But if you do it, like you have to put it in the same line, like this, or code transform. You put transform in scale, space, and the types you want. Because if you do it like this, which I was trying to do when I was trying to show some examples, it only takes one of them. It doesn't take both of them. So for example, if I did, I think it takes the second one. So this would move it 10, but it wouldn't actually rotate it. And I was having some trouble with that earlier, and I find out it has to be on the same line in order to make multiple transformations like that. So yeah, that's transformations. Rotate, stretch, spin, and move.
So how did you trigger something using CSS?
Usually you don't trigger it using CSS. Usually you trigger it using JavaScript. Because the only really thing you can trigger, quote unquote, with CSS is usually you can do that in 2 states. Because for example, I know there's an on hover, there's on click, there's like you can usually do switch between 2 states. Usually you can't switch like logical functions. If you use JavaScript, for example, you can use the DOM and like say, let's say I want to call this div my div. Say look for my div, and every time I click it, add 10 degrees. So every time I click, it'll be doing logically
Gotcha.
going up, and obviously once it gets to 360, it'll just keep going 370, 380, 390. But it'll on the JavaScript's that where you want to do the logical part of it. CSS is just the simple, like let's say I have a box, but I want it to go straight up and down, so I rotate it 90. That's usually how things like that go. You really don't do like I want it to be spinning with CSS. If I want to spin, I'll use JavaScript, which I'm sure Carlos will go into as he talks about JavaScript, or whatever level he wants.
Well, yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, I'll go ahead and stop sharing screen.
So
okay, so now I think everything was pretty good.
What's a custom library?
Basically.
I don't know what a custom library is. I was trying to. It said without custom libraries, and everything I found was just the default library.
No, I found a pretty cool website. Not website, a library. I forgot. It's Twitter LI, and it basically does everything for you.
I can see that. But I mean, most of the things I found that actually talked about doing the CSS code yourself, I didn't really see any custom stuff like that. I'm sure there is, but everything I saw was, as far as my knowledge, was not custom library. It was just the default library. Is all I found. Yeah.
So for my thing, I'm basically going to do the same thing. But I'm going to give an example, or I'm going to try to give an example of JavaScript, but it's not working. But okay. I'm going to go over the code to see how it goes. There's my screen sharing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. So here is an example of a very simple transition. You hover over it, and then the square expands. I'm pretty sure you saw this one in W3 Schools because that's where I got it from.
Mm-hmm.
It's very simple. And then an animation example. If I hover over it, nothing happens because animations have actually a timing of when and how long the animation is going to happen. So actually I need to refresh the page, and then you'll see it change colors. And then once it changes completely yellow, it goes back to red.
Cool.
And with JavaScript, you can hit like the play button, and this square should slide over, but I broke it. It's not sliding over right now.
Oh, yeah.
The code's actually very simple when it comes to transitions. Here's my little HTML with my CSS in it. It's basically with transition, this is the element transition basically dictates how your element's going to change. You give it what you want to change and then how long it's going to take to make the change. For this one, you see the transition is going to change the width and it's going to take 2 seconds. And then when you hover over it, it's going to expand by 300 pixels, px, right?
Got it.
And that's basically it. For transitions, you use the element transition, you give it what you want to change, and then you give it how it's going to change, if that made any sense, with hover. When it comes to animations are a little more complicated. And what I've read, it's better to use JavaScript animations than CSS animations, because CSS animations tend to be very choppy. The only upside of CSS animation is that it's a little more efficient, and that's why they become choppy. Because if you don't have good bandwidth, or if you're too old, it optimizes it, so it skips a lot of the steps that make it look pretty. But JavaScript, that's how professionals tend to do it, or they end up using libraries. But if you are going to use a CSS animation, one of the major things you need to focus on is the keyframes. The keyframes basically tells the program how it's going to start and how it's going to end. You start with a from, which the background color is red, and it turns it to yellow. The cool thing about CSS animations is that it fills in the middle spot. If you go back to the example that I was showing with animations, you notice that at one point it becomes orange, and that's all done through CSS. You don't actually have to tell it to become orange. CSS kind of figures it out. And then, of course, kind of like transitions, you can also give it an animation duration, which basically tells CSS how long it should take it to turn the red square into a yellow square. And there's a lot more, you could say, methods, like when to stop, when to repeat, when to recycle. You can actually make the square just go in a loop. Go from red to yellow, back to red, back to yellow. And then when it comes to implementing JavaScript, it's basically like any other function. Element class name, which my square was called box, and you can actually use it as an array. So I said there's going to be position 0, so the first position. And then I got my button right here, which calls my function. If the inner HTML is play, it starts moving the square, or else it stops it. And then it can also reset it. But for some reason, mine wasn't working, and I'm not sure why. I was troubleshooting it, but it doesn't move.
Do you need 3 exclamation marks in your equivalency?
You don't necessarily need 3.
I thought that meant it had to be like identical as 3.
Oh, really? Well, the
I thought it
play
was,
has
but
3. No, yeah, identical is 3. But technically, you can still use 2. It's pretty forgiving, but maybe that is the issue. Yeah, but I have 3 in my play. Pause. Oh. But basically, you just add becomes implemented like you would implement it in any other CSS function. I mean, DOM method to change CSS.
right.
But you just control the movement with it. And that's it. I don't know what else to show. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll see if I can help you with it after I fix mine.
So when you're making something like this, and this is probably a really silly question to you guys, but like the button script, you're using the onClick function and you're referencing a CSS animation, right?
Well, I just call the tag with an ID. And
You're
then,
referencing a JavaScript thing, not a CSS thing.
yeah, a JavaScript.
Okay, so that last animation was JavaScript, not CSS, right?
Yeah, the last one was JavaScript, but
Wait,
It
like
was
this
okay.
one or the one that was moving colors?
the one that was moving colors was
No,
just
that's CSS, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, all CSS animation.
Because usually when they have buttons and they have on-click listeners, that's when they use JavaScript. Because when you click it and JavaScript says, I have a click, then it'll say, okay, now I do something.
Can you use a click to reference to start a CSS animation?
No.
No, but
Not that I know of.
you can do a so like if you see here, the inner HTML is play, right? And if it is play, it starts changing it with a trigger. So you can change a CSS element, if that makes any sense. Like you can say get a property value, margin left, right? And then it starts changing it. So
Okay.
you can start an animation with JavaScript, but you need to call the property value. That's the method you would call, right? And then it looks for that property value and starts changing it.
Right. That's the DOM method is.
Yeah, the DOM method.
Cool. Yep, I read about that.
Yeah. So it's basically the same thing. And a lot of people say not to use animation for that reason, because in the end, all the important stuff is in JavaScript.
Mhm.
And the animation, it can sometimes just get in your way because it tries to oversimplify the code. It doesn't always run it if it notices that your computer is having a hard time with it. So if it's like a complex animation, most professionals just JavaScript it and modify CSS using get property values.
Cool. Good examples.
All right. So that's all the presentations.
Yep, that's it.